So this is where I just want to challenge people, I guess, to take a step back and take the focus a little bit off the person with dysphagia and actually start to reflect on who is the person that is the learner in this situation. And for the majority of my work, it is an adult carer. There's been very small exceptions to that when I've been working with the person who has a disability themselves, but the majority of the time it is an adult carer, whether that's a family member or a paid support worker. So if we identify that's the case, I think we need to consider the principles of adult learning as a framework within which to drive the development and implementation of our intervention plans with dysphagia. So if we have a little look at these, and I actually have to read the screen because it's too little line. So if we have a look, the first principle, adult learners, and look, you can, I just want to say at this point too, the field of adult education is massive. And obviously we're not going to capture that in a half-hour presentation. But Malcolm Knowles, really probably brought together some of this literature right back in the late 60s, early 70s, and it still forms a very strong basis for adult education design. So if we have a look, he proposed that one of the features of adult education is that adult learners need to be involved. They need to be involved in both the planning of evaluation and instruction of their learning. He then talked about the fact that adult learners learn best through experience, so that learning activities have to be experiential. Thirdly, he discussed that adult learners need to understand the relevance and impact of learning to their life, or as a colleague of mine always says, what's in it for me? Okay, that's relating to that core component of adult learning principles. And finally, adult learners do best when they're involved in problem-centred learning rather than content-orientated learning. So thinking about this framework, then what I wanted to do today is for us just to have a little look, because the literature does make some suggestions for how we can improve adherence to dysphagia interventions. And I want to just correlate a little bit then, break those recommendations down into how that fits with the principles of adult learning, and then just maybe expand on that a little bit with ways that I myself or colleagues I've worked with have taken that a little bit further in our clinical practice. So if we have a look at what the literature suggests in terms of strategies for improving adherence, Speech Pathology Australia talk about delivering information around dysphagia intervention, the training and support for that in plain English, and to include other supports that will assist the Mealtime partners, such as the use of videos, visuals, and translation. Chadwick and colleagues talk about helping family carers in particular to understand why recommendations are being made. Really links with that point around family self-determination. And Crawford and colleagues talk about offering training in implementing the plans. So those three literature-based recommendations really fit with that first principle of adult learning, and that's about having involved adult learners. So in clinical practice, the ways I have done that, or I've seen colleagues do that, is I have made it run of the course now that I talk to people about their literacy skills. So the learner, whoever needs to implement the plan. Experience has taught me that there's some really nice, relaxed ways to have that conversation without it needing to sound judgmental. So I will often say to someone I'm working with, great, we've come up with some really great ideas here about how we might be able to help Tom with his meal times. Now I've kind of got to put that all together. Are you a reader? Are you someone who would like me to type those out? Or are you more a pictures person? What's going to work for you? And it just opens the gateway to a conversation where people generally are very honest and say, oh, look, in all honesty, I'd much prefer it in pictures, or I'm not much of a reader, or no, that's fine, type it up and I'll put it on the fridge. So it starts that conversation. Run of the course for me and many colleagues I work with has always been around using videos and photo books to support the written information in a plan. Particularly, I've done a lot of work in Western New South Wales, particularly when you are seeing someone very irregularly. So a colleague of mine was based in central Western New South Wales and providing a once-a-term outreach to students in Broken Hill. And there was a person there with really complex dysphagia. So she developed a video which she then edited so the video would stop at specific points that related to the written mealtime plan, and text would insert on the screen that just highlighted, see how mum is holding the spoon at the side of so-and-so's mouth. That was a really effective way. And in terms of involving the learners, she would develop those videos with the person who best knew the person with dysphagia and say to them, well, you tell me, what do we really have to show in this video? What's the really important bits? I always ask people how and where they want recommendations presented, and I think this is huge. We just talked with your question about the systemic stuff with perhaps group homes or day programs. There is an organisational responsibility for organisations to be implementing plans. Thus, we need to involve them as the learner to dictate some of the information about how do you need this presented, where will it be presented, what will work for the staff who work in this organisation. And certainly I feel very passionately about the fact, and Rochelle certainly talked about it as well, that we need to support families to understand recommendations by being a translator of literature. And I think we saw that so clearly with Vince's sister in the opening video this morning. If the literature is grey, which we know a lot of it is in the field of dysphagia and intellectual disability, we at least need to be giving that balanced view to the decision makers in a person's life. Okay. So then the literature also makes some other suggestions for increasing adherence to plans. I'm really not going to try and say these authors' names. These authors are Sri Lankan. It was a fabulous paper. I can't pronounce that word. But they talked about including experiential activities in training activities, and they actually got far better adherence to plans when they did that. They also did when they included explicit teaching of texture modification in training, and they used a feedback cycle of modelling, observing and feedbacking, is that a word? Giving feedback to the person. So that really links with the second principle of adult learning, that adults need to learn from experience. So, you know, I think we relate a little bit to, if someone gave us a written plan on how to drive a manual car when we didn't have a licence, would that be enough for us to do that safely, consistently and well? Probably not, okay? So if we take that analogy, if we had experience of driving a manual car in a safe, controlled environment combined with instructions, are we more able then to follow the plan into the future? So certainly when I've run dysphagia training workshops, I do try to do experiential learning as part of that. So the old pairing people up and feeding each other with blindfolds on or lying down and different textures, that type of thing. I have also done that with families. So, you know, when there's been some resistance from a family or they're having trouble understanding the recommendation, you know, I'll say, I think we should have a go at this. I think we should get on the lounge and curl our body up. It'll help us understand what's helpful and what's not helpful. And then with food and fluid preparation training, Myself and my colleagues have often taken a video of that or developed visual step-by-step checklists. And the key component there within adult learning is getting the learner to identify what are the important bits to them that would need to be included in that visual checklist. Do we need a photo of the yellow scoop, or will you always know the yellow scoop's what you measure with? Right, I just saw the time, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so the literature also talks about improving adherence through educating mealtime partners on the possible consequences of non-adherence to recommendations and providing longer and more detailed guidelines, which I thought was really interesting because I think it's human nature to think if something's shorter, more people are likely to read it. But actually, this comes back to needing to know it, not just read it and to understand it. So this really fits with that third principle of relevance and impact to learners' lives. And as well as explaining the clinical implications, certainly in practice, at times if I've needed to, I've pulled the employer in, talked to them about what they see as their staff's responsibility for implementing plans, and then built that into my feedback to staff. Because perhaps the motivator, the what's in it for me, is I have to do this to keep my job, which isn't ideal. We wish it was all person-centred, but it's part of the puzzle. And certainly, some of you may be aware that FACTS recently released a new range, a new suite of templates for mealtime management plans. And the new template is longer than the previous template. And there's been, mixed opinion on that. It's only been in use for a little while, and there's been some really great feedback received from the use of that from family members and disability support workers. And we kind of fit with that literature-based recommendation. And I think there's a poster presentation about those resources at lunchtime. They're available to people outside of ADIC. Okay, just about there, which is good because I got my 5-minute card about 2 minutes ago. Okay, so if we look at our fourth learning principle, the suggestions for increasing adherence to dysphagia interventions that present in the literature are the use of feedback, modelling and scenarios in training. So remember, this principle is the principle of problem-centred learning. Finding ways to make mealtime partner supports explicit and more concrete. So remember I said the part of plans people aren't implementing well are the mealtime partner responsibilities, the pacing, the observing, the supervising. And then finally, finding ways for mealtime partners to adhere to recommendations for people who self-feed. So somehow getting across the importance that your role is no less needed because this person feeds themselves. So in terms of my clinical practice and my colleagues, I have actually found that sometimes when needed, a really effective training tool for this is videoing myself implementing a mealtime plan and allowing the person that I'm working with to jointly with me critique my own implementation of this. Because this really is at the core of the problem-centred learning. Because as the guinea pig, I can put myself out there and go, oh, cripes, I don't think I did a good job there of waiting till they had swallowed. That's really tricky with her to see that, isn't it? And then you are engaging that learner in the problem-centred learning process of going, maybe you could have tried, blah, blah, blah. Certainly looking at plans for different days, Rochelle alluded to this. I have worked with lots of people who have fluctuating abilities across different days, but the key, if we want to be true to thinking about adult learning principles, in developing those different plans is to incorporate the person who has to implement the plan in the development of that plan. How do I know this is a good day for her? What do we have to write on here to describe that this is the good day plan? What's a good photo of her showing those things? And again, talking to employers exactly as Rochelle said, that if it's an organisational issue, that the mealtimes aren't working to allow the supervision span for people to have those mealtime partner supports, then speaking with employers about how that could be remediated. As I said, adult learning principles in a tiny, tiny little pistachio nutshell. However, if nothing else, what I would recommend that you take is the message that for interventions to be effective, they must be adhered to. So let's start reflecting not on just producing the mealtime management plan, but how do we support people to implement that plan. With dysphagia interventions, think about who the learner is, and if that learner is a mealtime partner, then consider the principles of adult learning as a framework for your designing, implementing and monitoring of intervention.